As Canada's inquiry on foreign influence gets underway this week, the question is there a clear and present danger when it comes to Canada and its relationship with China's Communist Party of China? Are we at war with China? That is the question we're going to examine today.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me here today to talk about this clear and present danger around foreign influence and specifically regarding China, the Communist Party of China, is with me Scott McGregor. And Scott is a former intelligence officer with the RCMP, the Canadian military, among others. And he's an analyst, and he's also with a private intelligence agency right now. So welcome, Scott.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
Well, Scott, I'm not sure what to say. Whether I'm anticipating our discussion. I don't want to use the word excited because it is a very unnerving conversation. It's one that we often really don't hear enough of when it comes to our relationships internationally, but also with powers that really don't, frankly, have our interests in mind. And this is a very powerful question. And I want to start off by just getting a brief summary. Are we in the West at war with China?
Well, this is something that I've been trying to raise awareness around. Yes, Canada's at war with China. Or maybe we should put it the other way. China is at war with the West, namely Canada. And there's a lot of proof around that. One of the big ones is the fact that our government institutions are attacked about 6,000 times a minute by Chinese cyber. So that's just the British Columbia government agencies. That's an old figure. It's increased since then. But this information's been shared with law enforcement, intelligence, the military, etc. The general public, however, isn't quite as aware of the current situation.
Okay, so we're going to talk about war and all its multidimensions. War is not just simply kinetic or war in a physical sense. War is multidimensional, and anyone who's studied it knows it, that we have to use the full court press when it comes to war. And your thesis is saying, yeah, the Chinese are going after us, and we can't be naive to that. So we're going to dive into that. And so I want to begin with your story, Scott, in terms of how you got involved in understanding the reality of this situation. How did you get involved in intelligence?
Well, it started with me in the military. I served in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force as a Reg Force member. So I was an intelligence operator. And yeah, my foray into becoming an intelligence analyst takes place, back in about 2000. And I had to sit aboard and apply and get recruited into it and pass a bunch of training, etc. But I did a lot of travel. And some of the places that we went, mainly Afghanistan and the Middle East, opened my eyes to a lot of what's happening in the world of transnational organized crime. But the story that I'm gonna share with you right now that you and I haven't even had a chance to discuss yet is really the basis for not only the book, but my own mosaic effect, if you will. So taking disparate pieces of information and stepping back and seeing that it actually means something. So I deployed to the Middle East. I was a diplomatic defense attaché to the Kingdom of Bahrain through Saudi Arabia. There were 3 Canadians in country at the time. The U.S. Has their big naval base there, their headquarters.
Yeah.
Mainly that's looking at the Persian Gulf and Iran, which we can see now is quite a concern. It was back then, and it will remain so until something happens, which a lot of analysts are estimating will happen in the next 5 years. But what else we looked at was the Somalis and the Somali piracy piece. Well, during that phase, I was approached by myself and a British intelligence officer when we were approached by the FBI, the DEA, and NCIS. And at the time, people didn't believe that terrorists would work with criminals. And so they wanted to prove something called transnational narco-terrorism. And we managed to find ourselves a DAO that had both of those things on board. And what that did was give them a budget. So they created an operation under the DEA. It's something they use in Central America as well.
And maybe
And
you
that
should just
continues to this
clarify
day.
these. Maybe you should just clarify, Scott, these letter agencies, the Drug
Certainly,
Enforcement
sorry.
Agency.
Federal
Yeah.
Bureau of Investigations,
Mhm.
the Drug Enforcement Agency, and NCIS is the Navy's version of intelligence and military police.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So fast forward 5 years, and I'm leaving the military, and I make a transition over to the RCMP's E division, which is the largest RCMP presence in Canada. It's about 66% of all files in Canada are through the lower mainland of British Columbia. So I became an intelligence advisor to federal serious organized crime. And we began to look at what was going on there. I had always thought, Canada was just fine. Yes, we had a few problems and that kind of thing, but I was more focused on the external, having been the domestic intelligence analyst for the West Coast of North America. I was looking at terrorism and eco-terrorism and conventional threats and that kind of thing. But when I got to the RCMP, I ran into a gentleman. People may have heard of him. His name's Cal Krusty. And Calvin had been speaking with different letter agencies in the United States and actually had put offices in his own area at the headquarters for them to work out of. So once I started to kind of get an understanding of what they were seeing on the ground and sort of the information that they were interested in, I started to reach out. And one of the fellow that I was in the Middle East with, the British officer, by happenstance, was going to Washington State, and I happened to live on the border. So we got together and had a pint and a discussion. And he was heading to Washington, D.C. And on his way to D.C., he thought, okay, maybe I should just mention this. We ended up connecting with the largest, oldest intelligence agency in North America, which is the Office of Naval Intelligence. They have about 5,000 analysts in D.C. And they worked at something called transnational threats. So a lot of people, when they hear naval intelligence, they think it's all about ships and everything like that. Well, that's not the case. They look at anything and everything to do with trade all the way inland. They work extensively with other agencies like the Office of Foreign Asset Control under U.S. Treasury. They're the guys that put sanctions on the cartels and that kind of thing. So we had cartel activity, we had heavy Iranian activity, and a center of gravity for the Chinese. And these are, the organized crime pieces that at the time they were looking at. I brought in something called hybrid warfare and explained to them how that works. And that's, where nation states utilize things like transnational organized crime to achieve their agendas. So from O&I, they sent a couple of people out and we had a meeting and they got to understand what was going on. And, this kind of continued for a period of going back and forth. And I managed to get the RCMP to go to Washington, D.C. and have some briefings so they can understand the level of information that we're looking at. That included things like the DEA's Special Operations Division. They're the guys that took down El Chapo. And that's multinational. So we have Australians and Canadians and Brits there. And I started a think tank and brought in all of the Five Eyes intelligence agencies to the headquarters. And we also went over to a military base so we could speak about classified information that had connectivity with transnational organized crime. In Canada, law enforcement has a very limited ability to look at classified information and understand the connectivity between national security level and regular crime stuff. And so that was something that I had done a pilot project on while I was with the RCMP, convergences between transnational organized crime and national security. So I began to build an operations intelligence section underneath federal serious organized crime. And I had DERLOF, so I had direct liaison authority to look at every file that they held. So that's how we were able to discover what was going on and how the connectivity between criminal elements and national security concerned, national security threats, how they both existed in the same locations, the same threat streams, and this created quite a stir. Unfortunately, we ran into hindsight, a gentleman named Cameron Ordis, and he was the head of intelligence at its RCMP headquarters, who's currently in prison. And he happened to undermine pretty much all of the work that we were doing. And they put a stop to it.
Yeah.
So I left and I went over to the gambling enforcement branch under the Attorney General, and a report that I had written that was unclassified but protected managed to be shared with a lot of different agencies. And the incoming Attorney General, David Leis, wanted to know what was going on. So I gave him the report, and then
and he's now the current premier of
he is the current premier of British Columbia. Yes.
Yeah.
And so that briefing really opened his eyes to what was happening in the province and across Canada. And he requested Dr. Peter German to conduct some reports. So the dirty money reports that some people may have read, they're quite lengthy. A lot of that information is information that I had been working on. I shared all of my documentation and reference material, etc. And especially in Dirty Money 2, the second report, it talks about the cartels and the Iranians and the Chinese extensively. So those things started to gain a lot of traction, and we moved into the public inquiry, where I was not called as a witness, which was very strange to me. Although, my feelings towards what happened in the proceedings there don't exactly jive with what I think some people think happened. Yes, there were some recommendations. However, I don't believe they uncovered everything or exposed everything, and giving a person of interest that was the primary target in the largest money laundering case in Canadian history, e-pirate, which some people may have heard of, status to be at that inquiry kind of was a cause for concern. Go ahead.
Okay, so Scott, we're going to peel the onion today, and you've written a brilliant book. I would recommend it. It's called The Mosaic Effect. And if you describe the mosaic effect, you're really looking at connecting the dots so that the things that we see before our eyes here in Canadian daily life isn't exactly perhaps what you think you're seeing.
Right.
And so you did that. So what do you mean by the mosaic effect in a nutshell?
So the mosaic effect for this book is really my experiences that led me to understand the level of saturation of mainly the Chinese in Canada, and Vancouver being the center of gravity for all of their operations. In the intelligence sense, it's taking disparate pieces of information. So evidence is not intelligence. Evidence is raw data that we utilize it to become with an assessment. That's tricky in the law enforcement world, trying to get them to understand that. But having these little pieces of information come in from all these different sources, and then looking at how big the scope and depth of operations are, really was the impetus for us to go ahead and write this book. And the book's, we finished the book about 2.5 years ago, but due to all of the legal ramifications and what's called lawfare, we had to make sure that we could get the information out without being sued into into nothing. So that took a good chunk of time, but a lot of the information we managed to get out to media, the police stations and different things that you've probably read about. So that's really what the mosaic effect is in a general sense.
So in many respects, mosaic is really a profound revelation that given the unique information you could see, it wasn't just local police reports, and no offense to them, but they're seeing only part of the picture. And what you did is that from a classified intelligence angle, you were able to connect the dots, and you were able to see the breadth and depth of organized crime and the partnership with nation states. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah,
and all of this
very, very succinct. I like it.
So all of this is in effect undermining the interests of Canadians, because this is profoundly affecting our economy vis-a-vis an underground economy. But it's doing something else. It's undermining a lot of institutions and even decision makers, among many others. So that's kind of the needle we're going to thread today, or peeling that onion. I've used so many metaphors, but this is deeply concerning. This is, in effect, multidimensional war that's being waged in our country, and a lot of us don't even know it.
Yeah, I don't, I talk to a lot of people and ask them questions just on the street when I run into them and stuff. And you hear they know what's in the news. And so they don't have the complete understanding. If they don't listen to, podcasts, etc., they won't have a really strong understanding. People are starting to get the fact that China is a threat. That's the one change that I've noticed over the last few years. The sentiment is moving towards, and sometimes that's because it hits home. The real estate piece. Now we have this housing crisis. The cost of living has gone up. These all are representative of what's happening. It's part and parcel for what the Chinese are trying to do. It's written it right into their white paper, their military white papers. And so that's really the part that, for me, is the goal, is to create awareness so that people can make decisions about how to counter the activity. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say part of the context of this is not a partisan issue. It's not like, well, we're picking on the Conservatives or the Liberals or the NDP. No, everyone is kind of in on this. And this is a long history. This hasn't just happened this past 2 years. And all of a sudden we're, quote, having an inquiry about foreign influence as it's happened this week. And obviously there's many questions or parts of the mandate of that inquiry that's being held at the federal level on foreign influence. And of course, one of the top of mind concerns has been the last several federal elections, where it's clear that there was significant foreign influence on those elections. And we could reflect on, what was it, the 2019 and the 2021 elections. Do you think that inquiry will actually get at the bottom of the kind of depth and breadth of foreign influence, largely from the Communist Party of China, on our government?
Well, historical trend would indicate that no, it will not get to the bottom of it. There will be a lot of defending oneself, just like we saw in the BC inquiry, and deciding what information gets shared is being given to the government, not so much to the judge presiding, which is concerning. And who's been giving standing. There's a lot of things that people are concerned about, and not everyone's speaking out to the level that I think they should. But no one has much faith in this inquiry.
All right. And so, to be clear, you're not optimistic that the inquiry will get at it, not only because of the nature of the appointment of the judge, but also you don't even have the opposition party gaining standing. So they can't enter into full questioning of witnesses. They can't subpoena. I mean, it's like we need a full discussion. And this inquiry should be the basis for that. But it's kind of like a half inquiry, in other words.
Yeah, I think it's nice that people will get to know that there's concerns. Unfortunately, I have a feeling that a lot of these things will be passed off and explained away. But what we're talking about here is a national security threat. This isn't money laundering or just a criminal act or something like that. This impacts the national security of Canada. And if that's true, which so far it's been proven that it is true, and my book further proves it, that shows you that we're being attacked by China. Now, the inquiry will include some other countries, Iran and India and others, but for the most part, those are all partners of China, and to think that they act alone is silly. They act in concert quite often, and not just at an organized crime level, but from espionage, economic subversion, a number of different ways. And I don't think that this is going to get to the bottom of it. I'll be completely frank with you and your viewers here. Ottawa does not have the understanding at the ground level of what's going on. There's a reason we call it the puzzle factory. It's because things can be
Sorry,
pushed
the
around
puzzle,
and
the puzzle factory, you said?
yeah, we call it the puzzle factory in the intelligence community, mainly because there's so much misunderstanding of what's actually going on, and more people are a lot more careerist as
Mm,
opposed to being. Don't get me wrong, there are good people there, and there are people that are very concerned about the country, um, but more often than not, people have realized they can't do anything about it, and so they're more concerned about how they can take care of themselves.
mm, mhm,
And that's unfortunate. We also have people that call themselves experts, but they've been working on counterterrorism for their careers. And
mhm.
this is not counterterrorism. This is hybrid warfare. And it
Okay.
touches every aspect of Canadian life.
All right. So let's dive into that a little bit. Hybrid warfare, in other words, looking at the whole 360-degree picture of war. I want to start with a baseline question. Why would China undertake war against a wonderful group of people called Canadians? Why are they after us?
Well, that's a good question. The the mindset of China when they're coming into Canada is that one, we're a very easy target, and part of that is our naivete and our kindness,
Hmm.
which we like to tout. We also try to call ourselves peacekeepers for a long time, which
Hmm.
is a silly term. There's no such thing. There's peacemakers, and no one's keeping the peace. Ask any soldier that's gone overseas; they'll tell you.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so we have all the natural resources.
No, but let's just let's don't bury the headline on that. What do you mean by
Sure.
that? Like, because if you've served in a peacekeeping mission, you'll know that it's not about peacemaking. It's about what?
But
What's the mission?
it's about peacemaking. There's no way to keep the peace between two warring factions. If you're going to go stand between two people with guns and cross your fingers you don't get shot,
Hmm.
that's how we end up with things like the Midak pocket.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, the way to deal with those things is to go in and be the force that can stop those things from happening.
Right.
And we've tried to do that, and unfortunately, there's a lot of pushback when the West goes in and tries to do the right thing. I mean, we can delve into with the United Nations
Hmm.
Security Council and its corruption, and how China has a veto in the UNSCR. Canada does not, and yet we're part of the Five Eyes and
Hmm.
NATO, and we fought in World War II, quite extensively. So yeah, when you have a country that was a developing nation up until a few years ago, where Canada was sending China money, um, and they have a veto vote. They have control of many organizations now, and they've been doing it in Canada for the last however many years, and they're
Okay.
stepping it up now that Xi Jinping has taken over. Um,
So to
yeah.
be clear, we're dealing with a pretty aggressive superpower that's emerged the last number of years. It's certainly waged that influence effectively across, I at least in my mind, every international agency imaginable, including the World Health Organization to boot.
Mhm.
But why is China pursuing this kind of multidimensional warfare across the West? It's not just Canada, but why what is your hypothesis? Why are they doing this?
Yeah, undermining the West in general, if we're going to talk about what nation states are trying to do globally, between their alliances and everything else. So, economic prosperity is key to having a successful nation,
Hmm.
and that requires control. You hear a lot of people talk about follow the money, and that's a great investigative tool. But if you're trying to understand what they're doing, they have enough money. They have more millionaires per capita than any other country in the world. So it's about control. And for them, they import the majority of their food and water. And that population size needs to be able to grow. Right now, they're declining.
Hmm.
Xi Jinping's issued orders to not throw out your scraps on your table. So we know that there's more behind what they're doing. The South China Sea is one of the five choke points in the world, the Malacca Straits,
Right.
and it's the busiest, and it's the
And, and
one
and
where
just to be
they
clear,
need to
that's
control.
that's the area around Taiwan, right?
Nope. So that's actually more towards Thailand, Singapore, that area there. So the whole South China Sea is that portion. The Taiwan piece is really about the economic prosperity that Taiwan has and the control it does or has over a lot of the electronics. So being able to get in there and take that back, it's something that China feels historically that they need to engage in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Taiwan was never part of China. It's where
Mm-hmm.
the actual dynasty escaped to, which was taken over by the Japanese and then returned. It was called Formosa.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's not part of China. It's not a return
Mm-hmm.
of Chinese territory.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if anything were right, the people of Taiwan would be taking over mainland China to get back their country. Um, Needless to say, it's about this control piece and having the control in different areas. We see what China's doing in Africa, in Europe, with the Belt and Road Initiative, and the countries that have signed on to that. And now you're seeing Italy has spurned them.
Mm-hmm.
Canada has a Belt and Road headquarters for North America in South Surrey, which was hidden. We wrote an article about it, and that's something else that people aren't quite aware of. Why? What are they trying to do here?
Mm-hmm.
And that is take us over economically, um, alter us socially, and get us thinking that China's a nice, friendly country that really just wants what's best for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then, slowly but surely, what do we call it? Cooking the frog slowly by turning up the burner so that until it's at a boil.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
Canada's experiencing that. And unfortunately, once you've infiltrated our highest level of politics, that's when we have problems because there's not much you can do about it when the people in power are able to undermine efforts to stop that.
Mm-hmm.
We see
Okay,
that
so
with the CSIS Act. We see that with the RCMP. They're all
mm-hmm.
political. They're sub-ministries of the Ministry of Public Safety, and they're politicized, and it makes it very difficult for people to act on their own.
Okay, so there's a lot to
Yeah,
dive into there,
yeah.
Scott, because we're looking at how really a hostile power is using a myriad of ways to undermine Canada or really take control of it in many different ways. And that's really in keeping with a long history. As a kind of a student of history, you'd look at the variety of Chinese dynasties. You realize that China's always had a brilliant propensity to work with its neighboring countries, but particularly with their elites, to be
Mhm.
able to work with them to essentially through means of corruption, in effect, take them over as a vassal state. So you don't have to kinetically wage war. You basically take over the interests of that elite class, and then you're basically controlling that country for both economic, social advantage. Is that kind of what you see happening then, Scott?
Yes, and it's taken some time to get to that point. But if you speak to some of the Hong Kong dissidents, one of our contributors to the book, Ivy Lee, says exactly that Canada is already a vassal state of China.
We are
Um,
already a vassal
we're,
state of
we're
China.
already a vassal state.
And what would be the example of that, to be
Um,
precise?
so that we're having an inquiry into that right now.
I-
So there's a there's a document that was written in 1997, called OPRIP. No, sorry, pardon me. The Sidewinder Report. And the Sidewinder Report was written by CSIS and RCMP.
Yes, right.
And it was a classified document that was decommissioned or declassified, and it's available on the internet right now. And
And
they
where
speak
where
to,
could people
yeah.
read that report? Because that is a stunning report. Remember the Sidewinder report. Where can
Mhm.
people read that?
So if you just Google Sidewinder
Mm-hmm.
report, it will come right up.
Yeah.
I think Primetime Crime has a PDF document
Mm-hmm.
available there. Michael Juno Katsuyo is the author. He's also written, I believe, the forward in my book.
Yes.
And we've spoken extensively. And he's come out and stated that every prime minister since Mulroney has been compromised. And he stated that on the record in Ottawa.
Every
So
prime minister. So you say compromise. This is a very serious point. What do you mean by compromise?
So I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but when he says compromise, he's saying that these people have been influenced by the Chinese. And the level of influence can be done in a number of different ways. So whether that's monetarily or concessions that are made, power, lots of different ways. I think that's something that would be interesting to come up in the national inquiry, but I highly doubt it will.
Mm-hmm.
There will be people, I think, that want to push that envelope, but I'm not sure that it will. I would
Okay.
say that the information that comes out around the inquiry, where people are speaking to what happened during the inquiry, is where you'll get the most information about what's
Mm-hmm.
actually going on.
Okay. So, but to be clear, there's a lot of work that the Chinese have undertaken through direct police actions. In fact, we know that there's a number of Chinese police stations in Canada. I think many people would be shocked to know that. There are Chinese police stations in Canada. You also have actions that have been taken to influence various political decision makers, and those are actually well known in the public, perhaps not as known as they should be. But you even have, the MP, Michael Chong, as an example, where he has been undermined or attacked in different ways by operatives. So this is very serious. This is not hypothetical. There's all kinds of evidence to show these pathways to decision makers and also major political contributions to political parties. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely, that's a fair comment. And there's other information out there that in the public sphere, so open source information that
Mm-hmm.
clearly tells you that CSIS, our intelligence agency, our domestic intelligence agency, and the RCMP have investigations into exactly what we're talking about right now. So there's evidence. Because it's an investigation, it's not necessarily releasable. You can't FOI or ATIP that information to get it publicly. But some of that information has been shared. Sam Cooper's writing articles.
Mm-hmm.
I did an article with Graham Wood a few years back about the Justice Institute of British Columbia and how they were training Chinese police. One of those
Sorry,
police members was
can you
arrested in New
can you
York
repeat
City.
that? We have the British Columbia Institute for Justice, the Justice Institute, it's usually commonly referred to,
Yeah,
is training up Chinese police officers.
right. And what I was trying to say was, why? There's no need for it. They have a 99.9% conviction rate in China. So if you arrest someone, you you don't need to learn how we handle things, because you're not going to change how you do it. You're an authoritarian
Mm-hmm.
communist country.
Mm-hmm.
And so it didn't make sense. What we do see is them trying to infiltrate into regular police agencies, which happens. But that one instance of the woman that's arrested in New York City, after the article came out stating that that's exactly what they would do, further proved my assessment. So yeah, it's happening everywhere.
Okay. And so to be clear, part of this reality therapy we're going through is that you have to kind of open your eyes. If you use the lens that we're being attacked using this hybrid warfare approach by China, then it behooves us to open up our eyes and kind of look across the realm of Canada and look at every one of our institutions and say, what else is going on here? Are we misinterpreting? Do we need to go beneath the surface and say what's going on? And I'll give you one example. The level of Chinese influence in post-secondary education is stunning in Canada. Whether it's, the numbers of international students, but it's also the money being given to post-secondary education institutes in Canada to undertake research, to actually transfer intellectual property to Chinese operatives and organizations is on a large scale. And this has been going on for a long time. And I've actually seen this. So this is one example of many where typically the Chinese want to have partnerships, but what kind of partnership? And is it generally just one way, Scott?
Yeah, the motive will always be control. There's the head of Interpol, I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head. But he was from China, and he ran their spy agency for a while. The Chinese kidnapped him, and the international community had no idea where he was for 2 weeks. And then they said that they had arrested him for graft, and he's in prison now for 10 years. So that's Interpol. People that are on Interpol red notices have been in Canada extensively. Some of them have gotten very close to our current prime minister,
Mm-hmm.
Michael Mo Ching, for example, who's
Mm-hmm.
building the International Trade Center in downtown Richmond. Um, but magically, he's taken off that list and is allowed to stay in Canada. So
Wow.
there's a lot of things that the Chinese do when they say that they want to go into business with you. In the book, we have examples all the way to PEI, small towns that you wouldn't think that there's an interest
Mm-hmm.
there. But when there is a natural resource that they can get because our small town is having a hard time producing lumber and selling it to the United
Mm-hmm.
States or whatever, they step right in and just here you go, here's some money, and suddenly
Exactly.
everybody's happy. And it doesn't all go through channels like you would expect,
Mm-hmm.
because the mayor of such and such town decides to do a deal with the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And we have our local politicians aren't necessarily briefed. They're getting briefed now, I would imagine, now that it's come out in the media. But
Mm-hmm.
when I was there, I spoke to a bunch of security officers and they had no idea.
Yeah,
There's trade
that's right.
missions going on and they have no clue about what the espionage level is.
Exactly. So there's this kind of naive assumption on many Canadians' part that, oh well, no, this is a partnership agreement, and we'll have mutual cooperation, which at the surface sounds very admirable. But what's really going on? You'd have to look at that and examine it with a critical eye.
That's
I think
correct.
the other side to this is the economic front. We know that for some time now, one can barely go to any store, and let alone, ironically, a Canadian Tire. It's almost like the whole stores are filled with made in China manufactured products.
Mhm.
And so this is all part of a trend where persons were outsourcing our manufacturing to China on the assumption there was a lower wage. Now, the wage increases have very much narrowed. But what is the price of doing a lot of our manufacturing in China? What's going on there?
Well, it's again about control. Once you become reliant on that labor, which is interesting considering we have NAFTA and an agreement with Mexico, who's built massive factories on the U.S. border for the free trade agreement, and the labor there is much more affordable, and yet we've gone to China, and so that kind of also proves the political influence that's occurred over the years. Now, sometimes I wonder if originally Canada wasn't a little bit nervous about the United States taking over Canada and they wanted to offset that threat by, befriending China. That's a
Mm-hmm.
possibility, because China back then was not considered as big a threat as it is now. So
Mm-hmm.
that was perhaps a miscalculation. And then
Mm-hmm.
they fell in love with the money. So by offshoring everything, we're not refining our own goods. We have probably more natural resources than almost any country in the world. We have a
Mm-hmm.
small population of 45 million people. We have the largest undefended border in the world with the largest economy in the world. And yet here we are with massive homelessness. Um, our real estate prices are skyrocketing. Canadians are struggling. How is that even possible?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
and I wouldn't say it's necessarily by design, but I would definitely say there's intent behind, what's being done to us,
Okay,
and that there are ways around that.
but I think in your book, and you get at this in the mosaic effect, is you brilliantly confirm how there are certain rules of engagement if you do business in China. And obviously, any business person would want to access not only the production capability, it's almost like the workshop of the world now, but also the enormous potential of the Chinese market. Now, that consumer market in China really has not really risen according to many people's hopes and visions. It's done it to some degree, but not to the degree that we thought it would. But when you engage in China, you have to always agree to an ownership structure of minimally a 49-51 split in favor of the Chinese state.
At
And
best.
secondly, you have to sign off on a systematic transfer of intellectual property. And
Yes.
for me, this is very concerning because ultimately you're transferring know-how or knowledge that you've developed through applied research and other kinds of research, which is really the foundation of your standard of living. Those are the family jewels for our kids' future, is your intellectual property. That's the source ultimately of your wealth. But we've in effect set up a conveyor belt all in a one-way direction to China. Is that not a fair comment?
That's an absolute fair comment. And I'll be really bold and I'll say something else. There's no such thing as a rich Chinese person. How about that?
Yes.
Now that's pretty shocking to some people because you hear about all these millionaires are coming over here and they're buying these houses and they've got all this money.
Yeah.
All business in China is state run or state owned, period. You're allowed to have money if the communist regime allows you to have money. Ask Jack Ma how that works.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, you're allowed to do these things and you have quotas that are required by the government. Let's say you own a coal mine and you have to put 10,000 tons of coal out. Great. But you can put out 20,000 tons of coal. What happens to the other 10,000? That's where your black market comes into play.
Right.
And so working directly with transnational organized crime, basically Xi just wiped out the opposition and placed his own people in power.
Exactly. Yeah.
And allows them to go around the world.
Yeah.
Securing more and more assets.
Right. So in some respects, Scott, you're challenging us to not be naive as to who we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a group, the Communist Party of China, a sophisticated network of gangsters who run the show. They're totalitarian, and you make wealth on their whim, and everything is political, period.
That's absolutely true. I mean,
am I being unfair?
There's so many examples. It's not funny. I mean, look what they did to Hong Kong.
Exactly.
Hong Kong is not the same place. Ask anybody that doesn't want to go back there anymore.
That's right. Yeah. Despite all these assurances that somehow they were going to protect the uniqueness of Hong Kong's democracy, it was all chaff in the wind. So when it comes to the other form of efforts to undermine the West, I want to deal with the topic of culture because I'm fascinated by this as well. I think one of the extraordinary strengths that Western civilization has been this effort to safeguard individual rights and freedoms. And that has allowed also the opportunity, the freedom to innovate. And if you don't have innovation, you don't have prosperity. Okay? And this prosperity has only really been in existence the last 200 years at tops. And so that's important to understand. So when it comes to the Chinese war in our culture, I see this on many fronts as well, Scott. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, I would definitely say that the original Chinese culture is something, I love. I think it's amazing.
Traditional Chinese culture is amazing.
I mean, people also don't know that China's only been a country since, 1950 or something. They're a new country. Yes, the culture, the dynasties are ancient, but that wasn't China. The Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, those aren't new. Those are ancient, and some of the stuff is just wow. But what's happened when the CCP took over, and they happened to wait until the Japanese massacred tons of people during the Second World War to come in and start a revolution against the very government that was trying to fight to save them. They're ruthless, and they have goals. Unfortunately for them, they ran into Xi Jinping. This isn't supposed to occur for another 100 years or something. Xi Jinping is moving that up. He's moving up the timeline. He's talking about global domination by 2050.
Exactly.
And that's not just rhetoric or saber rattling. That's written right into their government policies. And we can see what they're trying to do now through their initiatives and their actions.
Indeed.
They've always been an internal nation, not concerned about other people. And suddenly now they're starting to push out. They're looking at a blue water navy. all these things. These are all indicators of what the intent of China is. What they're doing in Africa is astounding.
Hmm.
And so, trying to raise awareness about this threat is taking a lot of time, because people just haven't been prepared for it. They've always just seen them as
Hmm.
a docile country that's, has this friendly face, and they're really trying to maintain that. They're going to great lengths to maintain that,
Hmm.
lawsuits, etc., to try to keep people quiet.
Exactly. Well, and what I found amazing is that this past year in 2023, we saw the emergence of a lot of Chinese power in our face. We saw, for example, the emergence of surveillance balloons, high level altitude balloons, go right across North America, including Canadian airspace. And our response was essentially nothing. We didn't even scramble, to my knowledge, any of the fighter squadrons to take down that balloon, and it was all obvious to. Well, I'm this is in my humble opinion. It was pretty obvious it was a military surveillance balloon of that capability, and they would have seen it from the moment that it emerged into the atmosphere over China itself. So everybody saw it coming, and yet we chose not to do anything as it floated over ultimately into airspace over significant strategic missile command centers in the United States. What explains that? Why would we sit there and twiddle our thumbs?
Well, the one thing that when now that you're mentioning the balloons, comes to mind is when our prime minister stated that he ordered the balloon shot down. I thought that was really cute, because he doesn't have that authority. That goes to
Mm-hmm.
NORAD. Canada does not own an aircraft that can go to the altitude required to shoot down that,
Yeah, it's
that balloon.
pathetic.
So you couldn't have ordered someone else to go do it, because
Mm-hmm.
that's not how it works. Um, and so, yeah, we have made some changes to our military, and whether that's by design, some people will just say, "Hey, that's just politics." I dare say that that's not entirely true. The same thing that's happening with firearms, legal firearms owners that have to go through a ton of hoops, pay a bunch of money,
Mm-hmm.
and the government's trying to say that, in a roundabout way, that they're bad guys,
Yeah,
even though it's all been proven. Even the RCMP states that, all of the illegal activities happening by criminals. Um,
exactly.
but cutbacks in our military have been happening for a long time. Changes to our military, so our military culture has completely changed. Having come from the military, I'm still obviously connected to the Veterans Network,
Mm-hmm.
and no one can believe where we're at. When you have people come in and you're joining the military knowing you might have to lay down your life to protect this country,
Mm-hmm.
or you may have to go to war to protect other people. Um, it's very difficult to get that sense of capability, from our people, because we're just trying to retain folks now.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the same strength, intestinal fortitude that we saw
Mm-hmm.
during the Second World War, during the Korean War. It's just not there anymore.
Okay, so this is obviously one of the actions that any sensible Canadian government needs to do. It needs to understand how to have a proper, well-equipped military. How do
Yes.
we meet our NATO obligations? We're not even close to that. But you're saying something even more profound, and that is that the culture of the military is being undermined, and that puts us in a vulnerable spot.
Yes, I mean, I think we're looking at allowing foreign nationals to serve in our military. Our military
Pardon
is
me,
only about,
I wasn't aware of
at
that.
tops,
Foreign
maybe
nationals.
60,000 people, which is smaller than the New York Police Department.
Wow, just
Yeah,
utterly absurd. Yeah, what
just
a
to give you a
joke.
perspective. And that's not
Yeah.
fighting troops.
Hmm.
That's all the troops. So people that are actually pulling the trigger, just like we saw in Afghanistan, is very minimal. We do not
Okay.
have the means to protect our own borders.
So there's lots of evidence to show that we're being attacked or undermined, manipulated, if you will. Our elites are kind of vulnerable to absurd decisions or influence. The other side to it is even popular culture, and I think that there's many examples of this. China waging a kind of a war on undermining our culture, and I think of a technology platform that's so popular, which is called TikTok, and TikTok originates from China, And I think that's a fascinating example because and I've seen very insightful analysis on this, that TikTok is, its version is very different than the one used in North America versus the one in China. The one in China is about celebrating Chinese culture or authority with the CPC, the Communist Party of China. And it also is limited in terms of the amount of time that a young person could even be on the device. Whereas in Canada, TikTok is totally open. It tends to be very negative. I mean, it was stunning after October the 7th, the Hamas terrorist attack on Gaza. All of a sudden, the amount of TikTok narrative regarding Gaza went up 1,000-fold. So is this just organic changes of culture, or is this actually coordinated and propagated?
Yeah, there's definitely design to it. Not just TikTok, but other platforms have been utilized to try to control what you call pop culture. So cognitive warfare, psyops, information or influence ops, these are all part and parcel of utilizing technology to get things to go the way you would like them to. So if you're going to try to change a mentality around a topic, you can take both sides of the argument and create your own debate. I mean, Reddit is owned by the Chinese. The Wu Mao run Reddit. So once you are able to do that, you're able to start to slowly shape things, because not everything's going to be acceptable if you go super hardline. But as you start to introduce thoughts, and quite often you'll play on Western emotions, because we're very caring and giving and understanding. We like cute cats and all that kind of thing. So that's an easy target. And yes, do they control every aspect of it? I would say no. Do they collect information and utilize that information? 100%. Do they input information, disinformation, malinformation? Of course they do, because that's how you're trying to, change sentiment. That's how you're trying to get people to be more amicable to the Chinese way. And we see it. I mean, it does happen. Right now, there's a battle going on, and there's an awareness. But once it's the ease of use, humans take the easiest way, and TikTok's a quick and easy way to pass the time, etc.
Well, and it's interesting. Many jurisdictions are banning TikTok. Maybe Canada should take a page from those jurisdictions.
Would be nice.
So culture is a big deal. We always know that a high functioning family, let alone organization or country, needs a high functioning culture. And so within that context, I'm wondering, as a student of history, I've certainly studied the Maoist revolution and how that evolved, and particularly the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s in China, where all the norms from kind of, the extraordinary ages of Chinese traditional culture was kind of thrown upside down. It was like an uprising of the inmates in the prison, if you will. But it was incredibly destructive. Millions were killed. So is China in many ways undertaking that kind of cultural revolution in Maoist form across the West? Is it so many universities? I look at the social humanities faculties in our country and in Canadian universities. They are chock to the brim full of advocates of cultural Marxism. I know it sounds hard to believe, but people need to do their due diligence and look at it for themselves. But this kind of explains why you have places like McMaster University apologizing for celebrating the birth of our first prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. I mean, this is nuts. Yeah. So is that part of what you're seeing on the intelligence side, Scott? Give me reality therapy.
Yeah, I would say that the changes that you're seeing are impacted by a number of different things. Right now, young people don't have much hope in owning a home. There's this idea to become reliant on the government, so that here's your guaranteed wage, your living wage, which is a kindness that the West would think that you'd want. You don't want anybody to go hungry.
Of
But what
course.
they're not seeing is that the more reliant you become on a government, and then that government has been compromised, now you're losing your capitalist ideals. And capitalism is kind of what built the West, and made us so great.
Hmm.
And so the erosion of those things plays into totalitarian governments' hands. The promise of a utopia where we all get along and everybody has enough of
Hmm.
everything.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we have an example of Russia where that didn't work out so great.
No.
And here we have, and that's where China got, their idea of communism to begin with.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, they're years behind, the West, unfortunately. It's playing into their hands, and we've been
Hmm.
just giving it away.
Exactly. So if I understand you correctly, then some of this ideological nonsense is about kind of creating disunity. I think of the good book in Mark. It says a house that is divided will fall. A house divided will
Mhm.
fall. And so in this context, if we're always looking at each other through these ideological lenses, like through racism and all the other lenses that they're trying to impose, oppress versus oppressor, then we will see ourselves as the enemies rather than working together as a team in unity to build this great country. Is that not an obvious connection? This is very much a Maoist approach to dividing society, is it not?
The haves versus the have-nots. You'll see a lot of assessments out there right now that are stating that that's the way, North America in general is going. And China and other countries, but mainly China and Russia, um, sow dissent within a population, and they'll take both sides. They'll take the side of Trump, and they'll also take the side of Biden.
Hmm.
So they intentionally raise these issues and drive them forward, to create this division that you're talking about. Because, like you said, once you're divided, so the United States ends up going to war with China. We end up in a conventional kinetic war with China. Well, that's great, except for the fact that in China, you're all on board or you disappear.
Mm.
In the West, we have protests, and we have people that try to say, "Hey, there's got to be another way," and we have, so the determination isn't the same, and
Hmm.
makes us weaker. And that's what China and Russia and Iran have been trying to do for a
Hmm.
number of years. And it seems to be working. The evidence is in this pro-Hamas support, which, Hamas is a terrorist organization. So if you're supporting Hamas, by
Hmm.
it's shocking the level of support that they have. That just goes to show you how good they are at what they do.
Okay. So as we kind of wrap things up, Scott, I guess I want to turn to action. What are the no-brainers we should be doing beyond having an effective, capable military, as an example, being able to listen carefully to intelligence professionals? Um, how do we get things back on track here?
I've read a lot of things on uh, from professionals stating how we can make change, and one of it had to do with the whole gambling and money laundering piece, and they thought that policy was the way ahead because action would be too difficult for enforcement. Um, Now, we've taken that a step further, and we're looking at changes in legislation.
Hmm.
Now, changes in legislation are great, but you have to have the means to enforce those things. And that lies with our justice system. You can read about anything that happens in our country. People get murdered and they get 6 years in prison. People aren't happy with that. There's
Hmm.
more anti government sentiment right now than at any other time in history. So, are we close to revolution? Potentially. People don't have anywhere to live and they can't afford the food.
Hmm.
So how do we move forward and counter, the Chinese and the Russians and everyone else, mainly the Chinese here? Um, and I would definitely say that we need independent studies. We need a committee to decide things, and that
Hmm.
committee needs to be voted in democratically, not appointed, because our government has already done that and placed
Hmm.
the people that they want to make the same decisions that they would already make in power. So yeah, we need proper oversight, and we need legislation that we can actually enforce, and we need to have the power to actually serve justice,
Mhm.
then that'll be a step in the right direction. But all assessments right now are stating that, we're looking at a kinetic conflict with China in the next 5 years.
Oh my.
So, that'd be great to have all this legislation, but we all know how long that takes. So my fear is that we won't be ready, that we won't be prepared, and that should we end up going to war, we're going to be in a very bad situation.
So we really have a lot of work to do, and often these journeys begin with a new level of awareness regarding this threat and the associated actions that we need to do to root out this corruption and to build a stronger, healthier Canada. So I want to thank you, Scott, for joining us for this conversation today and for your leadership in writing the book, The Mosaic Effect.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.